the story of Gideon and the 300. The hills of Israel were covered by a people who had forgotten their God. Fear reigned, crops were stolen, and the Israelites hid in caves, humiliated by enemies who came like a plague upon the land. But it is in this scenario of ruin and despair that an unlikely man emerges, hidden, trembling, threshing wheat in a hole so as not to be seen. His name was Gideon. He wielded no sword, had no army, and even less courage. And that is precisely why God chooses him. What happens next is one of the most surprising stories in the Bible. An army reduced from 32,000 to just 300 men. A battle won without swords, only with torches, pitchers, and trumpets, and a miracle that echoes to this day as proof that God's strength manifests itself in human weakness. Prepare to immerse yourself in a narrative of faith, doubt, courage, and downfall. This is the story of an ordinary man who was used by God to change the destiny of a nation. I remind you to like, share the video, and subscribe to the channel. The darkness was not only physical in the hills of Israel, it was a spiritual and economic darkness. The people had once again abandoned their God Yahweh and turned to the storm and fertility gods of the Canaanites, Baal and Asherah, like a tragic clock. The cycle of the book of Judges repeated itself: sin, oppression, cry, liberation. Now they were in the phase of oppression, and it came from the desert. This was the historical and cultural context of Gideon. Israel lived in a loose tribal confederation, without a king, without a central government. Each one did what seemed right in their own eyes. Judges 17-6. This social anarchy opened the doors to the Midianites and Amalekites. They were not a traditional occupying army. They were nomadic predators. Every year at harvest time, they crossed the Jordan River, riding camels, a terrifying and fast military technology for the time. And like a plague of locusts, they devoured everything: grains, cattle, sheep, leaving Israel in absolute misery, forcing the Israelites to hide in caves and crevices in the mountains. Famine was a palpable reality. It is in this scenario of despair that we find our protagonist, but he is not on a battlefield. He is not a nobleman or an obvious warrior. We find Gideon of the tribe of Manasseh in the most unlikely place, a winepress. A winepress was a hole dug in the field, often hidden. Wheat, in turn, should be threshed on a threshing floor, a high and open place so that the wind would carry away the chaff. Gideon was threshing wheat at the bottom of a hole to hide it from the Midianites. This act defines Gideon. He was fearful, cautious, and at rock bottom. It was there, in the shadow of the winepress, that the angel of the Lord appeared to him with a greeting that sounded like pure sarcasm. "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Gideon, covered in straw and sweat, nervously looking over his shoulder, replied not with faith, but with a bitter complaint. "Oh, my Lord, if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders?" Judges 6:13. God's answer was simple. Go in this strength of yours. Gideon's strength was not physical. It was his own recognized weakness, the perfect space for God to act. Skeptical, Gideon demanded a sign, and God patiently granted it, consuming an offering with fire from the rock. Gideon's first mission was not military. It was spiritual. Before facing the external enemy Midian, he needed to confront the internal enemy, idolatry. God commanded him to tear down the altar of Baal, which belonged to his own father, Joash, and cut down the sacred pillar of Asherah beside it. True to his character, Gideon obeyed, but he did it at night. He was afraid of his family and the men of the city. At dawn, the city was in a fury. When they discovered the perpetrator, they demanded Gideon's death, but his father, perhaps touched by his son's nighttime courage, intervened with ironic logic. If Baal is God, let him defend his own cause. Judges 6:31. That day, Gideon gained a new name, Jerubbaal, which means let Baal contend with him, the fleece and the 300. When the Midianite armies gathered again in the valley of Jezreel, the Spirit of the Lord clothed Gideon. He sounded the trumpet, the shofar, and the northern tribes began to gather. An army of 32,000 men responded. But Gideon's old doubt was still there. He then proposed to God the famous fleece test, the ball of wool. First he asked that only the fleece be wet with wool and the ground dry. God did it. Unsatisfied, he reversed the request, the fleece dry and the ground wet. God, in his immense patience, with the fragility of Gideon's faith, did it again. Confirmed, Gideon was ready for battle, but God was not. The Lord told Gideon that his army was too large. If they won, Jael would say, "My own hand saved me." Then the divine reduction began. First, Gideon dismissed all the fearful. 22,000 men went home. 10,000 remained. It was still too many. God commanded Gideon to lead them to the waters. The final test was to observe how they drank. The vast majority knelt, plunging their faces into the water. A small group of 300 men simply lapped the water with their cupped hands. Bringing it to their mouths, remaining alert and ready, God said, "With these 300 men, I will deliver you." Judges 7:7. Gideon was left with 300 men to face the enemy. The sight of the enemy camp in the twilight was terrifying. They were the personification of the threat that plagued Israel. The Midianite army, along with the Amalekites and the sons of the east, were not only numerous, they were an overwhelming force that covered the valley. The biblical text later reveals to us the magnitude of this enemy. The Midianite camp housed a colossal total of 135,000 soldiers. They lay there, spreading like a plague, with their countless camels, like sand on the seashore. Judges 7:1. It was a disparity of 450 enemies for every man of Israel. Recognizing the terror this must have caused Gideon, God gave him one last encouragement. He sent him with his servant Purah to spy on the Midianite camp. There he heard a soldier telling another about a dream, a loaf of barley bread. The bread of the poor rolled over and knocked down the main tent. The other soldier interpreted, "This is nothing other than the sword of Gideon. God has delivered Midian into his hands." Judges 7:14. Hearing this, Gideon worshipped. His fear was gone. He returned to his 300 and gave them the strangest battle plan in history. Trumpets, empty pitchers, and torches inside the pitchers divided into 3 groups. They surrounded a camp at midnight. At Gideon's signal, everyone broke the pitchers, revealing the torches. They blew the trumpets and shouted for Gideon's sword of the Lord. The effect was absolute chaos. The Midianites awoke in panic, surrounded by lights and dreams coming from all directions, thinking that a massive army was attacking them in the confusion and darkness. The Lord took the sword of each man against his companion. Judges 7:22. The Midianite army self-destructed and fled in despair. Victory and fall. The victory was decisive, but Gideon's story does not end in glory. From here, we see a dark side emerge. First, the men of the tribe of Ephraim, who had not been initially called, confronted Gideon angrily for having been left out of the glory. Gideon still knew divine wisdom. He used diplomacy, not the stubble that remains of Ephraim, better than the vintage, the whole harvest, of Abiezer, the family of Gideon. Judges 8:2. He praised them for capturing 2 Midianite princes, and their anger dissipated. But Gideon's diplomacy ended when he crossed the Jordan, exhausted, pursuing the 2 kings. Shelves of Midian, Zebah, and Zmunah. He asked the men of the city of Succoth for bread, but they mocked him. Curious, Gideon vowed to return and tear their flesh with thorns. He made the same request at Peniel and received the same mockery, promising to bring down the city's tower. After capturing the 2 kings, Gideon carried out his brutal threats. He tortured the elders of Succoth with thorns and gourds in the desert and killed the men of Peniel. He then confronted Zebah and Zmunah, asking about the men they had killed at Tabor. They admitted it, and Gideon revealed that they were his own brothers. Consumed by blood vengeance, he ordered his eldest son Jether to kill them, but the boy hesitated because he was young. Gideon then personally executed the kings. Israel, grateful for their deliverance, offered Gideon something unprecedented. "The monarchy shall rule over us, you and your son, and your son's son." Gideon gave a pious and perfect answer. "I will not rule over you, nor will my son. The Lord will rule over you." Judges 8:23. It was his final act that tarnished his legacy. He refused the crown, but he asked for the gold earrings of the defeated Midianites. With this vast treasure of gold, Gideon made an ephod or priestly stole and placed it in his city of Ophrah. The Bible is clear about the result. "And all Israel prostituted themselves there after him, and Gideon and his household went there." Judges 8:27. The liberator who began by destroying an idol ended up creating one. Gideon had peace for 40 years. He lived a long life, accumulated many wives, and had 70 children. He also had a son with a concubine in Shechem, whom he named Abimel. "My father is king." As soon as Gideon died, Israel immediately returned to worshiping Baal, and Abimelech, the son of the rejected king, would use violence to seize the power his father had refused, massacring nearly all of his 70 half-brothers. Here are some of the most impactful lessons from Gideon's story for our day. 1. God finds us in our wine press. Gideon wasn't called when he was at his peak, leading armies or demonstrating great faith. He was found at the bottom of a wine press, a grape press, secretly threshing wheat. He was afraid, felt insignificant, mentioning that his family was the poorest in Manasseh and was bitter about his people's situation. We often expect to be ready or perfect to be used by God. Gideon's story shows that God doesn't call the qualified, He qualifies the called. He specializes in using people who feel weak, fearful, and inadequate. Our weakness is not an obstacle to God's power. It is the arena where He most likes to perform. 2. The first battle is against internal idols. Before Gideon could face the Midianites, the external enemy, God gave him a very specific task: to tear down the altar of Baal, which belonged to his own father, and cut down the gate of Ahera. This first mission was internal, domestic, and spiritual. We cannot expect to have victory over external challenges if we still maintain altars to idols in our lives. These modern idols can be pride, materialism, fear of the opinion of others, as Gideon did at night, or anything that takes the central place of God. True liberation begins in our own home, our heart, before it manifests itself outside. 3. God's mathematics defies human logic. Gideon gathered an army of 32,000 men, a number already smaller than that of the enemies. God then commands him to reduce that number. First, the fearful are dismissed. 22,000 go away. Then, through the test of the waters, the army is reduced to only 300 men. God was clear about why, so that Israel would not boast against me, saying, "My own hand has saved me." Judges 7:2. We live in a culture that values numbers, resources, influence, and power. God often acts counterintuitively, diminishing our resources so that our dependence on Him increases. He prefers an impossible victory with 300 dependent men to a probable victory with 32,000 self-sufficient men, so that there is no doubt who performed the miracle. 4. God is patient with doubt, but demands obedience. Gideon is a hero of faith filled with doubts. He asked the angel for a sign, the fire on the rock. Then he asked for the famous fleece test, not once, but twice, reversing the conditions. At no point does God rebuke him for his insecurity. On the contrary, He patiently provides the proof that Gideon needs. Having doubts is not the opposite of faith. It is often part of the journey of faith. God is patient with our questions and uncertainties. However, God's patience is not an invitation to inertia. He gives us the confirmation we need so that we can then act in obedience. 5. God's weapons are strategic, not conventional. Gideon's battle strategy was humanly ridiculous. Trumpets, empty pitchers, and torches were weapons of psychological warfare, not physical combat. The plan was to create confusion, panic, and cause the enemy to self-destruct. What exactly happened? The weapons God gives us for our spiritual and daily battles often seem weak to the world. Prayer, forgiveness, integrity, generosity, love, and proclamation of the truth. Our trumpets, however, when used under God's direction, these tools have the power to defeat strongholds that human strength could never overthrow. 6. Starting well doesn't guarantee finishing well. This is perhaps the darkest and most important lesson. After the glorious victory, Gideon has two tragic flaws. Revenge. He acts with unnecessary brutality against the men of Succoth and Peniel, who denied him help. The grace he received from God was not extended to others. The golden ephod. He refuses the title of king, a pious response, but immediately asks for the gold earrings of his enemies and builds an ephod, a priestly stole. The Bible says that this object became a snare, a trap for Gideon and his household. Israel began to worship it. Success is often a more difficult test than failure. It is easy for a great victory to turn into an ephod, a memorial of what God has done, which subtly takes the place of God himself. Gideon, the idol destroyer, ended his days creating one. We must take outward care that the blessings and victories of the past do not become the idols of our future, and that power does not corrupt our character. 7. The legacy we leave is defined by our consistency, not just by our great moments. Gideon's story ends tragically. After his death, the children of Israel returned to prostitution after the bullets, Judges 8:33, and the people quickly forgot God and Gideon's family. Worse still, Gideon's son Abimelech, whose name ironically means my father is king, rises up, massacres almost all of his 70 brothers, and plunges Israel into a bloody civil war. Gideon's victory was spectacular, but its impact was not lasting. Why? He refused the title but lived like a king. Gideon piously said, "The Lord will reign over you." However, he went on to have many wives and 70 children, actions typical of the kings of the time, contradicting the humility he professed. He created a spiritual trap, the golden ephod, which he made with the spoils of war, became an idol, undermining the very faith he had fought to restore. He failed to transfer the faith. Gideon was a great judge, but he failed as a spiritual father to the nation and his own family. His legacy was confused, the ephod, and opened doors to chaos, Abimelech. The lesson is that our lives are not evaluated only by our peaks of success, the victory with the 300, but by the total trajectory and what we leave behind. A lifetime of consistent faithfulness, even without spectacular victories, builds a stronger legacy than a moment of glory followed by private concessions. How we finish the race matters as much as, or even more than, how we start it. In short, the story of Gideon is the tragedy of human potential. It is the story of how God can use the most fearful of men hiding in a hole to accomplish an impossible salvation. But it is also a grim warning that the faith that moves mountains can be corroded by pride, revenge, and the subtle idolatry of success, leaving the legacy as broken as the pitchers that once brought victory.